Hello and welcome. You're listening to the COVID Inquiry podcast. Hosted by Elkan Abrahamson and Nicola Brooke from Broudie Canter solicitors, the COVID Inquiry podcast has been designed to provide commentary, opinion and key insights into the hearings from experts and those directly affected by the pandemic. Each week, Elkan and Nicola will be joined by guests to discuss events from the inquiry. Their interviews and conversations will bring you up to date on the implications of the evidential hearings in a readily accessible format and, most importantly of all, in plain English. This week, Elkan is once again joined by Lorelei King from the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group and Enda McGarrity, one of the lead solicitors representing the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Northern Ireland branch. Later in the show, for the first time, Elkan and Lorelei will also be joined by Thomas Jones, one of the barristers on our council team dealing with devolved issues relating to Wales, and Barbara Herbert, member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Welsh branch. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
So, hello everyone, this is week 5 podcast. This is Elkan Abrahamson here, and with me is
Lorelei King from COVID Bereaved Families for Justice.
And Enda McGarrity, solicitor for COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice, Northern Ireland.
So nice to have that Northern Irish accent with us again.
Good to be back.
Big week for Northern Ireland this week, some really big hitters in.
Yeah, it was kicked off on Monday afternoon as far as the Northern Ireland witnesses go with Sir Michael McBride, the Chief Medical Officer since 2006 actually in Northern Ireland. So an interesting witness and obviously a very clever guy. One of the most striking comments that he made was that the health service in 2020 in Northern Ireland was not as resilient as it was in 2009 for the H1N1 swine flu pandemic. So there's a couple of core reasons for that. I think they can be broadly summarised as being caused by the absence of the executive 2017 to 2020, the pressures brought on by Brexit and EU exit planning, and thirdly the broad impacts of austerity, which has really stripped the health service in Northern Ireland. So quite significant evidence from Dr. McBride. Unfortunately, at the end of the evidence, Brenda Campbell KC for the Northern Ireland families was going through her allocated questions. She had a 10-minute slot and was interrupted by my counting after about 8 minutes and told that she had went over time. So very disappointing interruption and probably reflective of the system and the time constraints that we're working with here.
And didn't the chair actually say, I will ask the question?
Yeah, it ended with Lady Hallett asking our question for us.
Yeah. What did you make of his testimony?
well, I thought that the way that the hearing was approached that day was unfortunate, to say the least. We weren't given advance notice. Had we been told in advance, everyone has to go at 4:15, the questions would have been structured differently, and Brenda could have finished at 4:50. And then having told her, you've run out of time, I think for the chair to take her with the questions in a way that in fact took more time, because the first time she hurried the question and the witness said, I don't know what you're talking about. So actually it would have been better to simply let Brenda get on with it. I just think it was very poorly handled and indicative of what I keep saying, that the emphasis in the inquiry is on process, not result.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what you just said, Enda, it's with all the witnesses, that seemed to be a consistent theme. Everything, because your particular problem in Northern Ireland is this fact of the lack of executive, and that keeps coming up again and again. And
yeah, exactly, and particularly with someone like Dr. Michael McBride, who has been the Chief Medical Officer and has really been embedded in the Department for Health for so many years in Northern Ireland. It was really key to gain an understanding from him as a civil servant as to how things are handled when there isn't an executive. And we got a little bit of that, but, you know, we didn't get to drill into all of the details, but we made some progress.
Before we leave day one, we had a witness in the morning who was Dr. Kirkella, and I just found his testimony very interesting. He was very intelligent, you could tell, but he said one thing I haven't heard yet in this inquiry. He was the first one to say, we were not even prepared for the flu pandemic. so many witnesses say, well, we're preparing for flu and not for, something like coronavirus. But he said, we weren't even prepared for that. And I found that intriguing.
Yes, and as you say, the politicians, one of most of the other witnesses, don't want to accept that because it gives them a slightly easier out to say, well, we were prepared for what we thought to happen and what was likely to happen, and we were all taken by surprise. And then the argument becomes, how much do you have to prepare for all these different contingencies? But to admit that they weren't even prepared for what they thought was coming, I think is much more damaging to them. I liked his description of himself as a historian of bugs and drugs.
Yeah, he was great. Day two, we had a very a former First Minister of Northern Ireland who is Arlene Foster.
Yeah, Baroness Arlene Foster, another interesting witness. There's quite a bit of finger pointing in her evidence, to say the least. Most notably towards the UK government, which is interesting.
Westminster, she went after them big time.
Yeah, and there was a perceived failure that the UK government didn't intervene to fill the gaps in Northern Ireland preparedness and planning. I think that's, it's important that isn't misunderstood, that civil contingencies is in fact a devolved matter. And it's disappointing that there was no or limited accountability or responsibility for the role that the Northern Ireland executive ought to have played in civil contingencies. She mentioned that the Northern Ireland office took a policy decision not to intervene at the time, and that as a result Northern Ireland were left without any ministerial cover. Quite worryingly as well in her evidence, she reflected that the executive office, having been restored in January 2020, she was not informed of the dire position that Northern Ireland's emergency response plans were in, despite the fact that in the same month, January 2020, a letter from the Civil Contingencies branch in the executive indicated that Northern Ireland were over 18 months behind on planning and preparedness. So that really reflects a systemic failure throughout the system in Northern Ireland, where even this very significant problem in January 2020 wasn't identified and escalated to the relevant decision maker.
Did I understand that she seemed to be saying a lot? She made this point several times, that if there was any deficiency, Westminster should have stepped in. They should have stepped in, and they did.
Yeah, that was the point she was making. I think as well, Northern Ireland politics are often characterised by an inability of politicians to agree. And to her credit, Baroness Foster agreed with some of the comments from Michelle O'Neill, who we'll speak about later, about the disconnected relationship between central government and the devolved administration. So I think it follows that central government ought to play some role, but I think to say that they had overall ministerial responsibility is perhaps a bridge too far.
Yeah. The interesting thing I found from her was in response to a question from Lady Hallett. So when she was talking about Westminster should have come in, Lady Hallett said, well, whose duty is it to tell Westminster that there are issues? And her response was, the Northern Ireland Civil Service can alert the Northern Ireland office. In other words, it's a civil servant's responsibility. Then we'll get to Mr. Penkelly later, but he was asked the same question. He said, his response was, oh, it's the politician's job. So you get this finger pointing.
Yeah. She also touched on the kind of schism, I think, that happened between Westminster and Northern Ireland, that Brexit caused problems.
Yeah, of course. And it's been actually quite disappointing for some of the Northern Ireland witnesses that Brexit hasn't been talked about, because it seems as though the inquiry had almost come to the conclusion after week 3 or 4 that EU exit planning, of course, was an issue, and therefore we don't need to talk about it as much anymore. But there's very distinct issues in Northern Ireland with Brexit, the land border with another EU nation, Republic of Ireland being the key amongst them, and I think it's an omission not to pursue that a little bit further with some of the Northern Ireland witnesses.
Can you tell me about, there was a lot of reference in the Northern Ireland testimony about the Bengoa report. I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah, the Bengoa report was an expert-led report in 2016, I believe it was published. And it was basically quite stringent recommendations on how the Northern Ireland health system should at that stage have been reformed. And because of the executive collapsing in 2017 and the pandemic and various problems that followed, the recommendations of that report have never been implemented. So I think that speaks to my comments earlier about Northern Ireland being the health service being a worse position in 2009 as opposed to 2020, when had that report been properly actioned and implemented, it would have been in a much more resilient position to meet the pandemic.
Did Robin Swan refer to that last week? Was he talking about, was he referring to the Bengal report specifically when he said there was a lack of reform?
Yeah, I think he did. And I think his main reasons or main justifications for having not actioned some of that, along with the pandemic, was some of the resource problems within the Department for Health. And, of course, the impact of single-year budgets and the inability to plan ahead in the Department of Health was the brief reasons, I should say, that he gave.
And Richard Pengelly, who is a civil servant, he's a former permanent secretary for the Department of Health in Northern Ireland from 2014 to 2022.
Yeah, an important figure as well, because this type of civil servant in that position really steps into the minister's shoes in some respects when the executive has collapsed. And on the point of the absence of the executive, Pengelly had commented in his statement that the absence of an executive had no impact in the Department of Health's emergency planning. And I think he had to accept, even indirectly, that just wasn't the case. It's clear from the evidence that a number of matters ought to have been brought to the attention of the ministers had they been in post in that period. One example is the pausing of the Public Health Bill in 2018, which was a decision taken by the Chief Medical Officer. That's obviously a matter that would usually require ministerial input. Obviously, in that scenario, with the executive not sitting, then that couldn't happen. So it places the civil servants in a difficult position. And I think this is where some of the finger pointing comes from in some of the evidence we've heard. But it points to really a systemic failure all around in the Department of Health, in my opinion.
What was your view on Pengelly, Elkan?
He was an interesting witness. There was the gap between what he was saying and what Arlene Foster was saying, which I thought was the different view from the civil service side and the politician side. He was quite resistant, wasn't he, to criticism, I think, just looking through my notes. And, for instance, asked about preparation, he said, well, we had a contract for contact tracing. The issue was scaling up. Similarly, with surge planning, we'd taken the work forward. And so what he was saying was, it comes back to this taken by surprise by the scale of it and by it being non-flu related, rather than accepting that there were deficiencies in planning overall.
Yeah, the other thing that came up was the first day briefing that ministers get. So when the executive was re-established in January 2020, incoming ministers will have received a briefing document which sets out their core responsibilities within their department. And it was noted that there was a single page of briefing for Robin Swan as the incoming Minister for Health, whereas we have the example of Matt Hancock. I think he received quite a large bundle of information. And quite concerningly, in the briefing, there was no reference to emergency planning. And he was questioned on this quite stringently. I think the thrust of it was that there was a failure by the Permanent Secretary to properly brief Swan, and his comments basically reflected that emergency planning was not high on the priority list in January 2020 due to industrial action. There was nurses striking at the time. I think we talked about this in a previous podcast. So that's quite shocking that wasn't high on the agenda in January 2020, given that COVID wasn't a secret to the world at that point. It had emerged in China already, and for that not to be escalated to ministers in January 2020, to me, is a significant failure.
Circling back to the health service reform in Northern Ireland, that was a big topic for Michelle O'Neill, who I loved. I'm going to say I just thought she was fabulous. A lot of passion. You could feel her passion. You could feel her frustration. I thought she was a wonderful witness. But she talked a lot, because that was her thing, wasn't it? Her main project was to, when she was to reform the health and social care.
Yeah, well, she was interesting because she was obviously the Minister for Health before the executive collapsed in 2017. So, she was central to the Bengoa report. There was some questions around exercise sickness, which fell within roughly the same period as Bengoa, and that was her stated justification for not personally attending the Cygnus exercise, to which she delegated that to her Chief Medical Officer, Michael McBride.
There seemed to be some kind of, and I can't remember the detail of it, but there was some kind of breakdown. It was different from Westminster government, wasn't it, about how the chain of command and delegation?
Absolutely, and this came out, one of the key takeaways for me from the week in general was that there's an issue with escalation of important matters to ministers. That might come about through the repeated absences of executives, where you have civil servants. I think Dennis McMahon described it as flying blind, having to take their own decisions in the absence of ministers. So that may come around from an independence of civil servants, but ultimately in a democracy, as we know, the ministers or the elected officials, matters must be escalated to them as appropriate, and obviously that can't be done when an executive isn't sitting. But through Michelle O'Neill's evidence, we heard that wasn't even being done in 2016 when there was an executive in place.
She talked about, I think she was talking about pandemic planning. She said there were two things you needed: a plan, but that has to be cross-party, and resources. So I thought, again, we have this thing, first of all, with the collapse of the executive, and also austerity. Again, she highlighted how much that interfered with things.
Yeah, the same themes. And what was positive about her evidence was that she was willing to make concessions on certain points and quite open to change, and seemed to be inviting almost a proactive approach, which I'm sure we will follow up on. In relation to civil contingencies, she accepted that there was a gap in the legislation in relation to scientific advice. She accepted that the Executive Office should have had a Chief Scientific Advisor in a similar way to the UK, and as a result, they weren't receiving appropriate scientific advice for 5 years before the pandemic. So quite a frank assessment of Northern Ireland's position, and an openness to change that and move that forward.
She had been Minister for Agriculture, so she really had a sense of what you called the epidemiological island with Ireland. And she talked about how it should be treated as one unit. You've mentioned that as well.
Yeah, that's right. And, it's important that doesn't stray into a political debate, and there's always a danger of that. But as a public health consideration, a lot of the experts have said that very thing, that an island should be treated as a single epidemiological unit. Difficult word to say. Yeah, but the interesting thing from Michelle O'Neill's evidence was that she thought that the British Isles and Ireland ought to be treated as two islands, a two-island unit, and that she had made some efforts, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic to contact Westminster to discuss the common travel area and how to approach that.
Was that when she described those meetings as ad hoc and tick box?
That's right. Yeah.
I love that phrase.
Yeah.
Put it on the sampler.
Yeah.
So I'm a fangirl. What did you make of Michelle O'Neill?
Just on that last point, she said that the Northern Ireland, the Welsh and the Scottish governments all supported what she called the two-island approach, but it never happened. And we come back to a theme we've discussed before, which is Westminster being patronising towards and ignoring the devolved nations. Another interesting comment she made again on the same issue. She said, when it comes to plant health and animal health, we have an all-Ireland approach. It follows logically we should have the same approach when it comes to public health. And you think, well, yes, it's fairly obvious when you put it that way. And it's just a shame that wasn't adopted.
Yeah.
But I thought she was very strong on what you've mentioned, which is her commitment to reforming the health and social care structure in Northern Ireland. And I think she admitted that it came at the cost of other issues which perhaps would have been addressed otherwise. And she's, I think, quite honest about that.
And then in the end of day 3, and I've never seen this before, but they have what they call it hot tubbing, apparently, where you have more than one witness at the table. So they had 3 who were all represented local authorities, I think, What did you make of their, including one from Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so that was actually interesting as well, and we heard about the disconnect between local government and the executive in Northern Ireland. There was this top-down approach, which we've heard repeatedly throughout the first few weeks, where it ought to be a more collaborative approach, starting with local councils and working its way up in terms of resilience and preparedness. An interesting comment was that the lack of statutory obligations means that the relevant authorities are not compelled to engage in emergency preparedness at the local level. And Miss Allen described the current position as a coalition of the willing. So basically, people who are willing to come together to deal with preparedness issues on the ground is what we have at the moment. Whereas we really need statutory obligations to compel that local response.
I noticed a theme that they seem to have, that they said they're expected to lead during times like this, at times of crisis, but they weren't getting information. There was this lack of communication again.
Which comes back to what we were saying before, weren't we? And one of the interesting points made there was about exercise sickness, which we've heard quite a lot about. And they said the sickness report was kept secret. Exercise took place in 2016. We didn't get the plan at all until judicial proceedings were instigated in 2020. And then the department decided to publish. And the impression you got, if you didn't know, was that they had to take proceedings to get it, but in fact it was nothing to do with them. And the question that follows on from that is, well, why weren't you trying to get it? But in fact, it was a doctor who took judicial review to get all these reports, and it was only after that started that the exercise sickness report was made public. They also said they didn't know about Exercise Alice at all until this hearing took place. It's just bizarre, isn't it, that you're having these exercises and not involving the local government or devolved territory local governments. Come back, and the concept of trust was raised again. We spoke quite a lot this week about trust, about the population having to trust the government, about local authorities not having trust with central government, and so on. And it is a theme that we'll probably come back to at the end of Module 1, I think.
We touched on this, I think, last week, just that thing about untapped resources. These local authorities have incredible knowledge, local knowledge, and that it's kind of squandered.
Yeah, Pete Weatherby, KC, actually raised some very pertinent questions about burial and death rituals, and I know that's a very important matter to the Northern Ireland families, given that some of the rituals in Northern Ireland are a little bit different and of course very important, as they are everywhere. So there was an agreement from Mark Lloyd that guidance should be developed to ensure that local government play a central role in dealing with scenarios where there are excess deaths and ensuring there's dignity in death and burial rights. So I think that was a useful comment from Mr. Lloyd.
And after them, I think we had Aidan Dawson, who's the Chief Executive of Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, so Aidan Dawson's evidence reflected a totally archaic picture of public health in Northern Ireland, where it seems they were light years behind in terms of their modelling and horizon scanning, as we've come to learn. He mentioned that legislation for public health was significantly outdated, dating back to 1967. That requires updating. He mentioned that they needed to employ a consultant epidemiologist. They needed to develop capacity for pandemic modelling. They needed to improve IT. So quite a worrying picture painted, and mentioned the impact of austerity on resources, the impact of the EU exit, diverting resources away from the Public Health Agency, and the ongoing impact of the executive. And Brenda Campbell, KC, on behalf of the Northern Ireland families, questioned Aidan Dawson about the degree to which these issues can be brought forward in the current climate, because during his evidence there was some commitments made to improving on some of those matters, and I think the thrust of it was then that in the absence of an executive, it's really difficult even now, even though the problems have been identified during the pandemic, to move any of them matters forward, because they're being impeded by ongoing political dysfunction in Northern Ireland.
I can't imagine what that's like in Northern Ireland. It just that extra layer of
Yeah, it's a very straightforward matter that has been identified that should and can be reformed, and it's still being stopped, which is very frustrating for us and the families.
In fact, I made quite a lengthy note of what he said, because I thought he said quite a lot of interesting things, but repeated that the absence of the assembly was a problem, obviously, although not initially admitted by the Department of Health. But he said in the absence of assembly, the drive to achieve things is removed. And that's one of the things, I guess, that we also heard from Michael Gove, who we'll get to at one point, which is that the function of government is to drive things and to question things. And the function of executive is to execute things. Or executive in the English sense, not the Northern Ireland sense, because of course you use it slightly differently. You're really getting the same pattern from almost every witness, aren't you? Certainly from the devolved nations, but with Northern Ireland, the unique overlay, no executive, and other actually unique issues. And I think it's fair to say a lot more time was devoted to Northern Ireland than to the other devolved nations.
Yeah, I think it was almost a week for Northern Ireland witnesses. I think roughly Scotland had maybe 3 and Wales 3 or 2 days. So yeah, a litany of issues, a litany of failures. I think the inquiry have grasped the majority of them. We would like to drill down into further issues in the Department of Health in particular, for example, but I think overall the main issues have been identified here.
Can I just ask you here, because I don't know if we'll speak to you next week, but just how do you think so far, what Module 1, what's your view?
Yeah, I think I've spoke before about the length of it, and I think we're in agreement that it should be much, much longer. I think for some topics we're probably just scratching the surface. But overall, as I said, the broad themes, the idea of absence of executive being a clear issue, that's been identified. The EU exit has been identified. The impact of austerity. And the big thing for us, one of our key goals was to identify the gap in scientific advice and the fact that Northern Ireland did not have a scientific advisor to the executive, and we've made those representations to the inquiry painstakingly, and thankfully we've made good progress on that this week. So overall the main themes are being quite well addressed.
Thank you for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast.